You're a tough guy.
He's a maggot, punk. You should have died when you was a baby. Maggot.
You threatened my life, you
Despite their fate hanging by a thread, these defendants just did not care and did the wildest things ever seen in a courtroom.
This is the worst case I've ever seen.
From fighting a judge, antagonizing prosecutors, to even throwing blows at the guards, these are the most disrespectful defendants of all time. Papers, phones, and zero remorse. The scene is set at Pike County Justice Court in Mississippi, and a man called Sidney Newsom is brought in to stand before Southern District Judge Aubrey Rhymes on a domestic violence charge. He is handcuffed, shackled, and for the first few minutes gives no indication that anything unusual is about to happen. He just spends his time fondling over his paperwork and listening to his attorney and judge talk back and forth intently. Then a transport officer taps the table next to him, and even though it is a small, routine gesture, Newsom does not take it that way. At this point, it is evident that he had been disturbed by something but remains quiet. Then, when his mother and brother walk into the courtroom shortly afterwards, Newsom moves toward them without permission, bypassing court protocol entirely before the officer steps in and redirects him back to his position. He returns, picks up his pen, and begins signing his documents. For a moment, it looks like the situation had settled, but it had not. Without warning, Newsom stops, turns toward the bench, and begins arguing with Judge Rhymes. The judge does not engage with it.
Of course, I know Judge Rhymes personally, but you never want to see anything like that obviously happen in your courtroom.
He orders Newsom removed from the courtroom on the spot, and that is when the tensions between them began to rise sharply. Newsom angrily scoops up a stack of papers and launches them at the judge.
Defendant Sidney Newsom goes out of control, breaking away from a female jailer, tossing items at Judge Aubrey Rhymes.
The transport officer assigned to him steps in to take control, but Newsom overpowers her with little difficulty. He grabs a telephone and throws that at the judge as well, then sends a computer monitor crashing off the desk. It was getting rough, so rough that the judge had to intervene personally, using his larger frame to bring the defendant under control and hence order him back to his own courtroom.
It was the judge who got control of the courtroom, pinning the irate inmate down on a table until additional officers could arrive.
Newsom's brother, who had been sitting in the gallery, was drawn into the middle of the situation when he tried to help the judge. But in a testament to his bad luck, the officers arrested the two brothers as offenders. When the dust settled, Newsom walked away from that hearing with something extra added to his record: a contempt of court charge and 48 hours in a jail cell on top of the domestic violence case that brought him there in the first place. 48 hours is not a long time.
Pike County say the defendant who threw that courtroom tirade, Sidney Newsom, could now be facing more charges for his actions.
But compared to what the next defendant was facing when he lost control, it was practically nothing. 18 years for one punch.
Anthony Redding of felonious assault. Now, court documents show he made an intimidating gesture towards the jurors, and then this happened. Take a look.
Anthony Redding was 49 years old and standing trial in Union County, Ohio for felonious assault. The charge stemmed from a single punch he had thrown at his girlfriend, one that landed with enough force to cost her an eye permanently. Throughout, Redding maintained that he had been defending himself, and he entered a not guilty plea on that basis. The jury heard his plea but returned a different verdict. Anthony Wayne Redding was guilty of felonious assault. The panel was dismissed and the courtroom moved into the sentencing phase. And that was exactly when Redding stopped holding things together. Before Judge Donald Fraser could say a word, Redding was already talking loudly, invoking justice and Satan in the same breath. His attorney leaned in and tried to pull him back from the edge. After trying to avail no, it was left to Judge Fraser, who cut through the noise and ordered that Redding be placed in restraints before the sentencing could proceed.
Custody in this case prior to the sentence, together with the future custody days while the defendant awaits transportation to the appropriate institution.
The prosecution made their argument for the harshest sentence available, walking the court through a record of troubling conduct that stretched back to 2008. When Redding was eventually allowed to speak on his own behalf, he used it to deny that he had ever intended to hurt anyone and told the judge plainly that whatever sentence came next would be the ruination of his life.
Mr. Redding, anything you would like the court to consider?
Didn't know of a girl, didn't have
Judge Fraser listened to all of it. Then he told the courtroom what he had observed. Looking at Redding, he could not find a single trace of genuine remorse. As far as the judge was concerned, that left only one appropriate response: 18 years in Ohio State Prison. Redding will not walk out of that facility until 2037, at which point he will be 68 years old. The next defendant did not just have a problem with his verdict, he had a problem with the entire system that produced it. The man who couldn't follow orders. 35-year-old Michael McDonald was out on bond in Nevada, awaiting trial on a string of charges connected to what had become an extremely bitter divorce and custody battle. His release came with conditions, one of which was a strict no-contact order. He was not permitted to communicate with his ex-wife or their children in any form. The state was now before Judge Kathy Hardcastle, arguing that he had broken that condition. The violation itself was not complicated. McDonald had mailed 2 gifts to his children at his ex-wife's address. His defense attorney stood and argued that McDonald had genuinely not understood that this would constitute a breach, that nothing in the packages was threatening, and that nothing about the act suggested violent intent. He asked the judge to keep McDonald free while the broader case worked its way through the courts. Judge Hardcastle had access to McDonald's full history, and it told a different story. She pointed to a pattern of repeatedly ignoring court orders, and then arguing afterwards that the orders had meant something other than what they clearly said. She was not satisfied that McDonald was incapable of staying within boundaries set for him, and therefore granted the motion to revoke his bond on the spot. The moment marshals moved toward him to take him into custody, McDonald pulled back. What followed was a physical struggle involving multiple officers trying to get his hands behind his back while McDonald continued resisting. At one point, he sarcastically told the officers he would put the handcuffs on himself, then kept fighting them anyway. And even though the officers warned him that he was seconds away from being tased, he did not stop. Eventually, he allowed himself to be taken into custody by force. When his broader case concluded, McDonald was found guilty of burglary, forgery, and perjury related to the divorce proceedings and was sentenced to 24 to 68 months in Nevada State Prison. The resistance in the courtroom that day added a separate charge of violently resisting an officer on top of everything else. Yes, McDonald's resistance was dramatic, but what Bass Webb did across multiple courtrooms over multiple years put him in an entirely different category. Kentucky's most dangerous defendant. Bass Webb is a Kentucky convict whose string of violent courtroom incidents and criminal acts earned him a reputation as one of the most dangerous defendants in American legal history. His record contains no single outburst. Instead, it is a series of escalating violent acts that continued even after he was behind bars. Webb's deeds first came to national attention during an arraignment in Bourbon County, Kentucky, where he was facing charges for deliberately accelerating his vehicle towards 2 jail employees in an attempt to run them down. When Judge Vanessa Dixon announced she was recusing herself from the case because she personally knew the victims, Webb lunged forward and spat directly into her face.
There's no way I want to try this case or have any further proceedings, or I'll have to see you for one further second. Set for the very hearing next week.
In a moment that was widely circulated afterwards, Judge Dixon sat perfectly still, made Webb stand and watch as she calmly wiped the saliva from her face and told him she had seen enough of him.
But this incident is far from the last time Bass Webb will spit in the face of the law.
While awaiting trial at the Fayette County Detention Center, Webb did not stop. He and 4 other inmates organized a jail riot. As officers responded with pepper balls and beanbag rounds, Webb ripped a heavy metal telephone box off the wall and threw it directly at a corrections officer's head. That incident alone earned him a 15-year sentence for third-degree assault. Webb was also connected to the murders of his 2 former girlfriends. During his second murder trial in Montgomery County for the 2003 killing of Sabrina Vaughn, he appeared in court with a completely shaved head covered in crude tattoos. Inscribed across his scalp were the names of specific judges, prosecutors, police officers, and members of the media, alongside the words, "must die." The presiding judge, Beth Mays, ordered that Webb be seated further from the jury box so the panel would not have to look directly at the threats written on his skin. When sentencing arrived, Webb refused to stand to receive his judgment. By the time all of his sentences were tallied, Webb had accumulated 37 years for the attempted murder of the 2 jail employees, 15 years for the riot and assault on a corrections officer, 50 years for pleading guilty to the murder of his ex-girlfriend Bria Runowitz, and a life sentence handed down in May 2017 for the intentional murder of Sabrina Vaughn, with no possibility of parole for at least 25 years on that charge alone. Webb terrorized courtrooms across Kentucky over more than a decade, but the most infamous courtroom disruption in American history belongs to a man who turned his entire trial into a performance. The man who saw the courtroom as a stage. Charles Manson's trial for the Tate LaBianca murders, which ran from 1970 to 1971, stands as one of the most disruptive and deliberately destabilizing criminal proceedings in American legal history. Manson did not approach the courtroom as a place where law was applied. He treated it as a stage. The most explosive single moment came on October 5, 1970, when Judge Charles Older denied Manson's request to examine a piece of evidence and cross-examine a witness himself. Manson shouted that in the name of Christian justice, someone should cut the judge's head off, then launched himself across the defense table with a pencil in hand, aimed directly at the bench. Bailiffs tackled him before he reached the judge, and as he was dragged out of the courtroom, he continued shouting. From that point forward, Judge Older began wearing a concealed firearm beneath his judicial robes for the remainder of the trial, a measure no judge in modern American history had ever been forced to consider before. Manson also used his physical appearance as a form of protest. Midway through the proceedings, he carved an X into his forehead and issued a statement saying he had crossed himself out of the world. The following day, his three co-defendants, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, appeared in court with matching marks carved into their own foreheads. Later in the trial, all three shaved their heads completely to mirror Manson. From the defense table, Manson coordinated disruptions throughout the proceedings. He would signal his co-defendants to burst into chanting, giggling, or singing during testimony, including during solemn statements from medical examiners.
Even in custody, Manson was controlling his women, instructing them to disrupt every step of the court process.
Because of the constant interruptions, Judge Older frequently had the entire group removed to holding cells, where they listened to their own trial over a loudspeaker. Manson's original defense attorney, Ronald Hughes, had actively resisted some of Manson's courtroom strategies. And mysteriously, during a court recess in late 1970, Hughes disappeared. Sadly, his decomposed body was found months later. It has long been suspected that Manson's followers were responsible for his death, but none of the methods meant to bring out the truth from him worked. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy and sentenced to death. When California temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972, his sentence was changed to one of life imprisonment. He died there in 2017 at the age of 83. During his time alive, Charles Manson was feared by most, very much unlike the next person, who was a popular meme at one point. The 2024 viral leap.
Back here in the U.S., on the harrowing scene in a Las Vegas courtroom, a defendant lunging at the judge who had just sentenced him.
Deobra Redden became a global news story on January 3, 2024, when he leapt over a 4-foot judicial bench in a Las Vegas courtroom and tackled Clark County District Judge Mary Kay Holthus mid-sentence. Redden had been standing before Judge Holthus for sentencing on a felony battery charge. His attorney had requested probation, but the judge reviewed his prior record of violence and indicated that it was time he experienced something different. Redden responded with anger, charged forward, and cleared the elevated bench in a single athletic leap, landing directly on top of the judge. And even though a law clerk and a courtroom marshal immediately intervened, a few members of the court still sustained injuries. It left the marshal with a dislocated shoulder and a laceration to his forehead, while the clerk sustained injuries to her hand. Less than a week after the attack, Redden was brought back to the same courtroom under significantly heavier security, wearing a mesh spit mask, padded orange mitts, and chains. Judge Holthus sentenced him to 19 months to 4 years for the original battery charge. He then faced an entirely separate set of felony charges for the attack on the court itself. On December 10 of the same year, a different judge sentenced Redden to 26 to 65 years in Nevada State Prison after he pleaded guilty but mentally ill to attempted murder and related assault charges. While the case was a humorous incident for many, it also triggered an immediate review of courthouse security across Clark County. Physical barriers were raised, wider gap zones were installed between defendants and the bench, protocols were updated to require multiple armed marshals to stand directly behind felony defendants during sentencing, and high-risk defendants were ordered to appear in full restraints as a standard precaution. Redden's attack shocked the country and made global headlines. The next defendant didn't need to be in the room to make her feelings just as clear. A sharp-mouthed defendant. Sherry Lynn was appearing remotely before a judge, represented by a public defender, on charges of felony battery and resisting arrest with violence. From the moment the hearing began, her attitude toward the proceedings was evident. When the judge asked whether she had ever received treatment for mental health issues, Lynn responded by telling him to go and do something to himself that cannot be repeated here. Judge Glazer acknowledged the comment with some initial amusement before addressing it directly, telling Lynn he was trying to help her and asking her not to use such language in his courtroom. Lynn did not adjust her approach. As the judge worked through the charges against her, which included an alleged attempt to strike someone with a pair of pliers, he issued a no-contact order directing her to stay away from the alleged victim's home and place of business. Lynn challenged the order, demanding to know who the alleged victim was, but the judge reportedly answered wittily, saying he was the person Lynn had allegedly tried to hit with the pliers. The hearing continued with Lynn interjecting throughout. Judge Glazer maintained his composure throughout, ultimately suggesting that Lynn consider seeking medical attention before the hearing could conclude. Lynn was ordered to pay a $50 fine. Aside from that, she made her displeasure known at every opportunity. Keith Ferguson, on the other hand, was facing a courtroom for something far more serious, but his response was just as difficult to watch. Life without parole. Keith Ferguson appeared in a Michigan courtroom in Kalkaska, having already pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of his estranged wife, Tiffany Ferguson, and the second-degree murder of her father, James Weber. The circumstances of the crimes were deeply disturbing. Ferguson shot Tiffany, then drove to her father's home with the children in the car and killed him as well. Luckily, the children managed to escape to a neighbor's house. It was then that the police were alerted, and to hide away from the authorities, he broke into another property, barricaded himself inside, and tried to wear them out. After some time, he eventually surrendered to the police. Many believe the main reason for all this was Tiffany's recent decision to file for divorce. Even before the sentencing hearing, Ferguson had shown deep hatred toward the court. At prior appearances, he had been uncooperative, refused instructions, and directed profane outbursts at the judge. On the day of sentencing, he refused to stand, telling the court he could not, and that he was leaving his body behind. The prosecution requested the maximum sentence, citing the double murder, the flight from police, the home invasion, and the presence of the children throughout. The judge set bond at $10 million, and a friend of Tiffany's delivered a victim impact statement during which she recalled warning her friend that something terrible would happen, also stating that she said her ex-partner loved his children too much to go through with whatever was being imagined. When Ferguson was allowed to speak, he offered no apology or remorse, speaking only about the impact the situation had on him. Judge George Mertz sentenced Ferguson to life in prison with no possibility of parole, telling him directly that he would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. After the verdict was read, Ferguson showed no visible reaction to the sentence, in stark contrast to the next person's reaction. From guest book signature to life sentence. Kwahuru Gowans was 38 years old when he faced murder charges in Brooklyn Supreme Court connected to one of the most disturbing cases in the borough's recent history. Gowans lived across the street from the Brazel family and had a prior connection to the victim's mother through their shared neighborhood. On February 14, 2005, 19-year-old Rashawn Brazel left home heading for the Gates Avenue subway station to meet his mother for a Valentine's Day lunch, but he never arrived. In the days that followed, fragments of Rashawn's body were recovered in a subway tunnel. A hand and forearm were discovered at a Brooklyn recycling facility. His head was never found. Court documents revealed that Gowans had attended Rashawn's funeral and signed the guest book. The detective assigned to the case later stated that Gowans had expressed hatred toward Rashawn because he was gay, describing him as an abomination based on his interpretation of religious teachings. DNA evidence recovered from Rashawn's body linked Gowans to the crime. In court, Gowans attempted to stand and assert his innocence, but was not permitted to do so, as it would have disrupted the proceedings. When officers attempted to fingerprint him as required, he refused and struggled against them until the judge ordered his removal. Gowans was required to return to court every day until he agreed to be fingerprinted. He subsequently entered a not guilty plea, but was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison. While Gowans disrupted the proceedings from the defendant's table, another defendant had a different approach. He picked up a phone and made his intentions known to law enforcement, way before his case ever reached a courtroom. The defendant with the most audacity. Before Alan McCarthy ever appeared in a courtroom, he called law enforcement directly to make a threat. On the recorded call, McCarthy told the dispatcher that a crime was about to happen if his children were not returned to him, that he had a gun pointed at the building, and that he intended to shoot the judge responsible for his custody case the moment she arrived. He was not speaking in vague terms. He named the act and described where he would be waiting. Detectives arrested McCarthy for making criminal death threats against a sitting judge, a judge he incorrectly believed had been responsible for removing his children from his custody. A year later, in a separate courtroom, he faced sentencing for those threats. McCarthy's conduct during the trial never changed from start to finish. When asked to take an oath, he refused, insisting he was not under oath despite having raised his hand. He was disruptive throughout the proceedings and was eventually removed from the courtroom before the trial concluded. He was found guilty on all charges in his absence. During sentencing, McCarthy continued directing profane outbursts at the judge and at court staff, repeatedly refusing to stand and threatening the judge directly. Eventually, these outbursts led to his removal and detention a second time, prompting the judge to deliver the sentence without him present. McCarthy was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in Florida State Prison for the primary count, with an additional 5-year consecutive sentence for a second count, giving him a total of 20 years. McCarthy never acted like a true villain. He never acted like someone like David Paradiso. From the witness stand to the judge's neck. David Paradiso was 28 years old and on trial in Stockton, California in March 2009 for the murder of his girlfriend Eileen Pelt. He had stabbed her in the neck in the back seat of a moving car driven by his own mother. The case was already deeply disturbing before the trial took its most extreme turn. During testimony, Paradiso took the stand. When the prosecutor asked him directly why he had killed Eileen Pelt, Paradiso responded that she deserved to die. The statement provoked an immediate emotional outburst from his mother in the gallery. Judge Cinda Fox called a recess, and the jury began filing out of the courtroom. As the room was clearing, Paradiso moved from the witness stand, approached Judge Fox from behind, grabbed her, and began stabbing her repeatedly in the neck and forearm using a handcrafted 6-inch metal spike he had concealed inside a medical knee brace he had been permitted to wear into the courtroom. The spike had bypassed standard security sweeps entirely because of its location. Lodi Police Detective Eric Bradley, the lead investigator on Paradiso's murder case, was seated in the courtroom observing the proceedings. As Paradiso continued attacking the judge, Bradley and the defense attorney rushed the bench. Bradley pressed his service weapon against Paradiso's chest and fired, killing him and ending the attack. Judge Fox survived and required stitches for the wounds to her neck and arm. She initially attempted to return to the bench within a week, but the lasting psychological impact of the attack proved too significant. In January 2010, she retired from the judiciary early, citing the emotional damage she had sustained. The incident prompted an immediate security review across California courthouses, with particular attention given to the screening of medical devices and personal equipment brought into courtrooms by defendants. Paradiso's attack was shocking, but the deadliest courtroom attack in American history came 4 years earlier, in a courthouse that had assumed it was prepared for anything. The Nichols killing spree. On March 11, 2005, Brian Nichols was inside the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta, Georgia, for the retrial of a case in which he was the defendant. And it was during this trial that he decided to do something that later became known as one of the deadliest and most consequential security failures in American courthouse history. Nichols was being held in a temporary holding cell before proceedings began. Because he was not shackled, he was able to overpower the lone female sheriff's deputy assigned to watch him, beating her severely and taking her service weapon. Armed with a stolen gun and moving through a courthouse full of people, he walked directly into the courtroom of Judge Roland Barnes, who had been presiding over his case. He shot Judge Barnes in the head at point-blank range. The judge died instantly. He then turned the weapon on the court reporter Julianne Brandau and killed her as well. Nichols then fled the building. On his way out, he shot and killed Sheriff's Deputy Hoyt Teasley, who had responded to the ruckus inside. He disappeared into the city, and a massive manhunt involving local police, federal agents, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was launched immediately. It lasted 26 hours. During that time, Nichols also killed an off-duty federal immigration and customs enforcement agent named David Wilhelm. He was eventually located after taking a woman named Ashley Smith hostage inside her apartment. He surrendered without further violence and was taken into custody. The trial that followed was one of the longest and most expensive criminal proceedings in Georgia history, lasting several years and costing the state an estimated $20 million. Nichols was ultimately convicted on all counts, including 4 murders, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The attack prompted an immediate and sweeping overhaul of courthouse security protocols across the United States, with particular attention given to the handling and restraint of defendants in holding areas, the staffing of security posts, and the physical separation between defendants and court personnel. The single deputy assigned to watch Nichols that morning became the central point of the security review. At the same time, Nichols turned a courthouse into a murder scene in under 10 minutes. Colin Ferguson took a different approach entirely. He walked into his own trial, fired his lawyers, and decided to handle everything himself. Ferguson, the self-attorney. On December 7, 1993, Colin Ferguson boarded a Long Island Railroad commuter train in New York. He opened fire on passengers, killing 6 people and wounding 19 others before being physically tackled and disarmed by 3 passengers while he was reloading. It was one of the deadliest mass shootings in New York history. What followed in the courtroom was, by almost any measure, just as difficult to process as the crime itself. Ferguson initially retained prominent civil rights attorneys William Kunstler and Ron Kuby to represent him. The defense they proposed was known as the Black Rage defense, arguing that Ferguson's history of experiencing racism had pushed him to a psychological breaking point. Ferguson rejected it entirely. He then made a decision that stunned the legal community. He fired his attorneys and chose to represent himself, despite having no legal training whatsoever and despite the overwhelming evidence against him, including dozens of eyewitnesses and the 3 men who had physically wrestled him to the floor of the train. What unfolded during the trial was unlike almost anything seen in an American courtroom before or since. Ferguson referred to himself throughout the proceedings in the third person, consistently calling himself the defendant Colin Ferguson as though he were a separate person observing the case from a distance. He stood before the jury and delivered an opening statement in which he argued that 93 counts on the indictment corresponded to the year 1993, and that the real shooter was a white man who had grabbed Ferguson's bag and fled before police arrived, an account directly contradicted by every witness present. He then proceeded to cross-examine the survivors of his own attack. Passengers who had been shot sat in the witness box and answered questions put to them by the man who had shot them. One survivor, testifying about the moment he was hit, was questioned by Ferguson about the specific details of the shooting as though Ferguson himself had not been there. The nature of those exchanges left observers, including the judge, struggling to describe what they were watching properly. Ferguson also questioned police officers, medical personnel, and investigators, frequently losing track of his own line of questioning and making arguments that had no legal foundation. Judge Donald Belfie intervened repeatedly throughout the trial to keep the proceedings on track, at one point telling Ferguson directly that his questions were irrelevant and would not be permitted. Angrily, Ferguson consistently pushed back against these rulings, insisting he knew what he was doing. The jury did not take long, and Ferguson was convicted on all 6 counts of murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 315 years, with an additional 8 months in state prison, a sentence the judge structured to ensure he would never leave. He is currently incarcerated at the Upstate Correctional Facility in New York. He has filed numerous appeals over the years, all of which have been denied. The 3 passengers who tackled him on the train were widely regarded as heroes to this day. Ferguson's decision to represent himself gave his trial a flavor that no one in that courtroom could have anticipated. Nikolai Soltys brought no such theatrics. What he brought was something far harder to sit across from. Nikolai from the largest manhunt in Sacramento history. Nikolai Soltys arrived in the United States from Ukraine in 1999 with his wife Lyubov and settled in Sacramento, California. On the surface, he appeared to be building an ordinary immigrant life. But what happened in August 2001 shattered that appearance completely and left investigators dealing with one of the most disturbing family violence cases in California history. Over the course of a single week in late August 2001, Soltys murdered 6 members of his own family. The victims included his pregnant wife Lyubov, their 3-year-old son Sergei, his cousin Tatiana Loganova and her husband Dmitry, and 2 of their children. The youngest victim was 2 years old. The killings were carried out at multiple locations across the Sacramento area over several days. Soltys used a knife in the majority of the attacks. After the murders, he disappeared, triggering one of the largest manhunts in Sacramento County history. Hundreds of law enforcement officers were involved in the search. Even though tips flooded in from across the state for more than 2 weeks, Soltys evaded capture. He was eventually found hiding in the backyard of his mother's home in Sacramento, thin and disheveled after weeks outdoors. He was taken into custody without resistance. Not that he could have offered any resistance, as he appeared severely malnourished. The contrast between the violence of the crimes and the quiet manner of his arrest struck many of the officers present, but it didn't end in his mother's backyard. In the courtroom, Soltys proved deeply unpredictable. His behavior across multiple hearings was erratic and difficult to manage. He refused to cooperate with basic court procedures, ignored instructions from the bench, and caused disruptions that repeatedly halted proceedings. His demeanor throughout was described by those present as disconnected and volatile, making the normal management of the case extremely difficult. Hearings had to be structured around the possibility that he might become unmanageable at any point. To solve this and potentially protect those in charge of interrogating him, the court ordered repeated therapy sessions to evaluate his competency to stand trial. This process stretched the proceedings out considerably. Soltys ultimately pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder in 2002, avoiding a trial. Because he pleaded guilty, the full courtroom confrontation that might otherwise have unfolded never materialized. Still, the disruptions during his preliminary hearings had already made it clear that managing him within the court system was a significant challenge for everyone involved. He was sentenced to death and currently sits on California's death row. The case remains one of the most referenced examples in Sacramento of the intersection between domestic violence, immigration stress, and catastrophic family breakdown. The 6 victims, among them his 3-year-old son and his pregnant wife, who never had the chance to deliver her child, remain the center of everything this case will always be remembered for. Everything else, including the courtroom conduct, exists in the shadow of what Soltys did to his own family across that week in August 2001. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.